This podcast contains spoilers, so listen at your own risk or call back after you've watched the movie.
You know who you call. Leave a message. Maybe they'll call you back. Then again, maybe they won't.
We're having ourselves quite a little game of phone tag here.
Ring. I usually get this guy's answering machine.
I'll call you right back.
If you're there, please pick up the phone. I really want to talk to you.
I check my fucking messages every day when I come home from work. My answering machine, zero. I got a blinking light.
All I have to do is pick up this phone right here, inform the cinema, and your plan's kaput.
No, I ain't got no phone. I had to pull, because people calling all the time, and who needs the aggravation, right? Interruptions.
Just walking to work now. Decided to leave without any kind of jumper, hoodie, or jacket, and just purely a Hawaiian shirt, so hopefully that works out for me. Clouds do look a little ominous, but I think it's going to be warm at least all day. This morning I finished off Some Velvet Morning, continuing our exploration of the films that Neil LaBute has written and directed. Would have been better had I watched it all in one sitting, but my life right now just kind of prevents that. So I watched half of it 2 nights ago and half of it last night. I liked it. I liked it quite a lot. It's by far and away the least cinematic of the films that we've viewed from him. It feels like a made-for-TV movie, but not even made for American TV, a made-for-English TV movie. The camera really is just there to make sure it captures both performances. That's about as interesting as it gets. In fact, it's not too dissimilar from if you just watched a filmed version of the play. That doesn't bother me as much as it could. I think I can imagine that being like a major complaint for some people, but for me, it's a fairly minor detail that I find I can get past that very quickly. I certainly would always prefer something cinematic. I mean, I'm thinking of the Anthony Hopkins film, The Father, which is kind of similar in the sense that it's just basically a play, a bunch of people talking in a house, moving from room to room. Yes, is significantly more cinematic, and I'm not holding The Father up as some sort of uber cinematic film, but they exist on a spectrum, and Some Velvet Morning is as uncinematic as it gets. Now, that does put the emphasis 100% on the dialogue and performances. And we've sort of said, as we worked through his films, that sometimes the dialogue, maybe it's what actor's hands it's in, maybe it's sort of slightly different writing styles from play to play. But we've said that some of his work, it feels very theatre. It feels very stylized, heightened, doesn't feel like how people actually talk or interact with each other. And then sometimes that artifice sort of melts away and you can kind of accept it as reality. I think when it's the latter, it's probably helped by it feeling like some sort of unified stylistic world, or maybe just having more going on than just people talking to each other. This film feels very theatre. Alice Eve in particular, who does much better than I've seen her do ever, but in my opinion is not a brilliant actor. Stanley Tucci, I have for quite some time felt is a brilliant actor, and he's got some tough stuff to pull off here. And there's occasional moments like the cowboy shooting in the air shtick, for example, where he doesn't pull it off, but it's maybe just too much to ask of an actor. Alice Eve does fine, and I think we've seen that across all of his filmography, the difference between brilliant acting and sufficient acting. And then I think you would probably say Paul Rudd, his filmography has included horrific acting, but that's well-trodden ground between us now. I think for me, all of the actors, and there aren't many, we're talking about 15 actors or something, but all of them across the 4 films are good enough. Often, like Alice Eve and Gretchen Mol, they're doing much better work than you're used to seeing from that actor. But then there are occasional performances that are really fantastic. And I think any shortcoming that we see from Stanley Tucci here is a limitation either of the script or of kind of the casting, in the sense of like Tucci's sort of playing against type in a way. I mean, like, he's such a nice, warm guy. He's short, and I mean, that's not necessarily against type because it's kind of works, but you would typically expect to see this film with like a Dominic West or something like that. Not Stanley Tucci wouldn't be in the top 100 names that would have come to mind for me, but I think he does very, very well. Yeah, I actually quite like films that are basically plays, and I like, you know, the sort of bottle episode type thing of like it's all set in one location. It's very light on resources, be they the amount of actors in the film or the amount set in real time, or any of those super contained films. That's always intriguing to me. I'll say this, seeing as we're not avoiding spoilers and we've both seen the film. There's a film called High Tension, French horror film by Alexandre Aja, that would maybe be my favorite horror film of all time, or would certainly be top 3 or 4 horror films of all time for me. But it has the most disappointing ending of any film I've ever seen. This film is now entering the annals of, they screwed it up at the ending in a major way, in an unforgettable way. I don't know how you feel about that. And I mean, I feel like we could almost just talk exclusively about the ending of this film, and perhaps we're on the same page, perhaps we're not, but it's a really massive swing. And up until the final 3 minutes of the film, I buy the events of the film. I don't buy it as the reality that we live in necessarily, although it's very close to that. Like, certainly buy it in terms of the internal logic of the film and everything that's been established from the beginning of the film. It works, bar maybe the occasional line of dialogue here and there. When we get to the final 3 minutes, I then cease to buy the entirety of the film, and that's really the worst thing that an ending can possibly do, in my opinion. It taints the whole experience. Like, I don't think I'll ever watch this again, but I certainly am much less inclined to ever watch it again, having now seen that ending. But, sometimes you got to take big adventurous swings, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. It's just surprising here. It's not only is it a dud of an ending, in my opinion, but it's also quite un-Neil LaBute in terms of his continuing mission statement across his films of sort of showing the darkness of humanity. I just think you've already done what you do, and now you kind of muddy the waters. But yeah, I did like the film a lot. I'm just going to catch my train here now. A few bits that I was less enamored by, but I'll probably send you another voice note, or maybe you can reply to this one and we'll talk about it at greater length. Got to go catch this train, get into the office, make that money. So I'd spend my 4 or 5 minute walk to the office, adding a few more notes. Yeah, one other thing I wanted to comment on was the chemistry between the two isn't as good as it could be, which seems weird to say considering there literally is nothing in the movie other than the two of them interacting with each other, and to whatever extent the film does work, it kind of rides on the success of that chemistry. But at the same time, I can imagine this film being better the two actors had a further degree of chemistry, and that kind of works in the sense of she actually doesn't like him anymore, and he kind of doesn't like her, and he certainly doesn't like himself. And so the disconnect between them does kind of work, and it is kind of a strength to the film. But where the lack of chemistry between them is exposed chiefly is those occasional moments where there's supposed to be a glimmer of what made them work in the first place, where he makes her laugh and he goes, it's a nice release, isn't it, having a laugh. And any time that she laughs, or they laugh together, or he makes them laugh, or just that they get that kind of energy back, I think that falls completely flat. So it works kind of as a story about two people antagonistic to one another, and it works on many levels in terms of their relationship. And you can imagine that, for the most part, it was a business exchange. They were both it was very transactional. They were just getting out of it what they wanted. But we're led to believe that they sort of fell for each other. And in his case, it could be sort of like a self-delusion thing. He thinks he's in love with her, but actually he's just looking for something of substance in his life. But I don't think that's necessarily the portrait that they paint on her. I think it's more that they're sort of suggesting that he genuinely, or she genuinely did fall in love with him, and that she genuinely does like his personality on some level more than the rest of her clientele. But of course, like the shape of things, we don't fully know what's real and what's not real about her take on things. And ultimately in the ending we find out that the whole film is null and void. So anything I'm saying here now is a criticism of the experience of watching the film up until the end reveal. So you could argue that everything I'm saying now is null and void, but in terms of actually just watching the film and enjoying it, those are the areas that I kind of struggled with more. Another thing worth noting is that I think it's a very interesting conceit. Like, if you're going to make a film that's literally just two people talking in a house, you've got to have something interesting to hook people in with. And I think the nature of the relationship, and again, I'm omitting the final 3 minutes because it's almost impossible to talk about this film accounting for the final 3 minutes. Although it's not impossible, and we should, but just for the time being, it's not what I'm doing. The conceit of guy who was seeing a call girl, and having an affair, and then it went toxic, and it ended, and now he's just thrown all his chips in on that in some mad moment, and she's sort of moving on. She's clearly moved on from him, but she's also sort of moving on in her life, and going, let's plot these two characters in a room, and one of them wants to leave the house and one of them wants to stay in the house. And I haven't talked about harassment or the kind of almost horror side to this film, which is very interesting and very well done, I think, and provides a lot of the energy of the film. But all that is a brilliant setup, and beyond the setup, it's very well explored, and manages to keep two people in a house talking to each other consistently interesting until the final 3 minutes. So, hats off again to Neil LaBute. I mean, this is, I suppose, what you would want to see when a playwright becomes a filmmaker. And I think all the films that we watched are just plays of his that he's then adapted. I could be wrong on that score, but I think they are. So it's less a playwright switching to the medium of cinema than it is a series of a playwright's plays being shown to us in the medium of cinema, if that pedantic little distinction makes any sense whatsoever. Now, we've ranked all the other films, I think, maybe not formally, but we've certainly discussed how they relate to one another in terms of our appreciation. I'm still completely on board, and I think The Shape of Things to Some Velvet Morning is a 10-year gap, whereas the next film that I'll be watching, I don't know about yourself, but the next film I'll be watching, I believe is only 2 years after this one. Alice Eve again, and Matthew Broderick. I think, again, we're like in The Shape of Things, we're seeing the stage actors take on the roles in his films, which makes sense. It's probably why you end up getting performances from actors that exceed what we've seen from them up until that point. So yeah, I'm not sure if I'm coming out of it with many great questions. I mean, when we watched The Shape of Things and In the Company of Men, we came away with this sort of enigma to unravel. And I think any enigmatic nature of this film, or most of the enigmatic nature of this film, is just callously erased in its final minutes. And then you got to go, okay, what? So do you want me to sit down and do the math on the whole rest of the film and go, okay, so why did he need that? And what was that like to her? And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You could do that, but then you're basically sitting down and writing an entire screenplay yourself. Maybe he wants you to do that. Would be interesting to hear LaBute's thoughts on why he pulls the rug out from people and kind of tasks them with reappropriating the entire picture.
Hey man, good to know you can rock a Hawaiian shirt at work and be still taken seriously. That's where you make the big bucks. Yeah, so I had quite a strange experience with what's the movie called? The great start to this voice note. Some Velvet Morning. I had a feeling early on that what I was watching wasn't entirely real. And part of that is because I've seen movies fairly recently. I wouldn't say they're exactly like this by any means, but where the question of what I was witnessing was called into question. There's a movie with Chris Abbott called Piercing. I don't actually remember what it was about, but I remember questioning the dynamic of the characters. And I don't know if that prepared me for this, or the fact that you talk about the chemistry between Stanley Tucci, who I really like, and the chemistry with him and Alice Eve, did you say? I feel like these actors have a chemistry problem with Neil LaBute's writing itself. And I don't know if that let the cat out of the bag. I mean, it fully didn't let the cat out of the bag, because I got it wrong in what I thought I was seeing, because I actually thought for some reason they were a married couple and that were acting out some kind of psychological thing from the beginning. Just in how he introduced himself and saying, hey, it's Fred. And just her interaction to that kind of tipped me off to something to begin with, that something was off. And that actually made it quite unbearable at times to listen to the conversations in this movie. You mentioned Dominic West. Our man Aaron Eckhart would have been absolutely perfect for this role, actually. He's got that level of unlikableness, that level of charm, that level of being able to switch multiple roles, as we've seen throughout this mini Neil LaBute marathon, that Stanley Tucci doesn't have. I guess he is Stanley Tucci in this movie. Yeah, I was never interested in the relationship. I was never interested in any of the dialogue. I was never interested in the conversation. Now, maybe that's where I thought the movie was coming from anyway, in terms of I was waiting for some kind of reveal of the falseness of this movie that I wasn't quite sure what it was. So that made it very frustrating to observe something that I didn't think was natural behavior, even in the world of Neil LaBute's dialogue, if that makes sense. So I was very much on the wrong foot of this movie to begin with, which was a problem. The other thing is, the movie's shot like almost like a student film at times. And I haven't had to bring this up in our Neil LaBute film marathon, I guess, at this stage, as I said, so far, because the televisual nature or the stage play origins of his work never was a problem. And just looking here, In the Company of Men is based on a play. Your Friends and Neighbours is not. The Shape of Things is. And Some Velvet Morning is, quite obviously. And I feel, first of all, if you have which he definitely does, if you have a stage play eye as a director, then the dialogue needs to do its work. It needs to be very good. And I don't think the dialogue was very good in this movie, and I don't think the actors were very good at delivering his dialogue anyway. And I don't know which side that falls on more, but it was certainly less interesting dialogue to me than these other films by quite a bit. And the other thing was, I kept on thinking how uninterestingly this is stylistically from even a playwright's point of view, like an adaptation of a play. And I think you really need to do more if the dialogue isn't absolutely perfect. For instance, the house they use is really boring and generic, and all the shot choices was really boring and generic. And I was thinking, maybe sometimes it's just really hard to do. And then I thought of something like Fences, directed by Denzel Washington. And it basically takes place mostly in the backyard, sometimes in the house. And obviously we get that opening shot early on the street out the front, which is great. It does go a long way of stopping it feeling like the world exists in the back garden. But there's so many interesting visual choices along the way in a movie like Fences. And I'm not saying that In the Company of Men or Your Friends and Neighbours have them in a abundance, but they certainly have them a lot more than this. And even the houses they used and the staging they've used in stuff like Your Friends and Neighbours and In the Company of Men is a lot more visually stimulating than this. Maybe it's the fact that it was shot in film as well, which we talked about. And the other thing is, there's powerful scenes in those movies, like the Jason Patrick scene we talked about, where it's like he's talking to the audience and we feel complicit in hearing his dialogue and doing nothing. Even though that isn't based on a play, it still has that same play energy. I can imagine hearing that in a play. And the staging of the scene is very much like a play. He's talking there's the camera, which would have traditionally been the audience. And In the Company of Men has that as well. It feels like they're projecting the energy of their conversations to the audience via the camera. So in that setup, in that sense, there's a powerful level of emotion generated that I just didn't feel here in the slightest. And this is why maybe it also doesn't help that I don't think they're the right fit for his dialogue as well, because that energy that's there with his dialogue is just completely missing from these actors. And you mentioned as well that I don't know if you used the word misanthropic or not, but that's certainly how I view Neil LaBute's work. Well, the character, should I say. And you mentioned that all his other work has that, and then he pulled the rug out from the horrible nature of it in Some Velvet Morning. I feel like he continues to do exactly what he did from the very first movie we watched, In the Company of Men. He's almost like a dialogue-based M. Night Shyamalan, in the fact we think we've seen something else, and at the very end, or at least much later in the film, something is presented to us not quite how we've seen. And it's in every movie. In the Company of Men, we thought Aaron Eckhart's character pulled the wool over the deaf girl's eyes, because that's set up, that's established. But then we find out at the very end, there's a twist that he actually pulled the wool over his friend's eyes as well and set him up. In the shape of things, we thought something was presented as something it wasn't, yet again. And then we found out that actually these were the terms of what we're watching. So I feel like there is a thread line and a through line thematically with all his work, that we think we're seeing something else, but by the end of it, we've actually observed something else that we can recontextualize. And that's something that I really like about his work. Now, I can't remember if there's something like that in Your Friends and Name. Oh yeah, actually, there kind of is, because the woman from Heat and what else was she in? The Good Wife or something like that. She's looking for love and she's looking for things. She's looking for a certain something, and then at the very end, she's finding what she doesn't need in the arms of the psychotic Jason Patrick. So we're always left with having to question everything we've seen before in one way or the other. And it's just like Rachel Weisz recontextualizes the entire relationship between her and Paul Rudd. Neil LaBute has done that in all his movies so far. So I feel like it's exactly in keeping with everything we've watched so far. Whereas in this, we think we've witnessed something completely heinous, only to find out that it isn't. So we had to recontextualize yet again everything that has come before us. So for me, I think that's very much in keeping. Now, where this movie really falls down, from my point of view, is that it doesn't give us much time to deal with the ramifications of everything that's gone before it. Now, the same complaint could be made of In the Company of Men, because at the last second something is revealed. However, we've already dealt with it previously in the film, in the setup of what they're trying to do to that woman. So in a way, we've already dealt with it, and now we're just dealing with it again. So we have time for it to sit with us a lot more retrospectively, because it's more like, oh, this is ×2. In the Rachel Weisz breakdown, she's staring at the audience, she's giving a big long speech, and she's talking for a long time about it. And again, in the staging of her speech, she's addressing the audience through the camera, which is what I like about his directing, and that having the eye of a stage play director. It's not necessarily a criticism when it works right. It's very powerful in transferring energy to the audience through the characters. So when she's recontextualizing Paul Rudd's relationship, she has a long time to do it, and we have a long time to deal with it. Whereas in this, it's done so late. What I would like to have seen, again, it's not to write the movie that didn't happen, but I feel like we should have seen another 20 or 30 minutes of them interacting in a different way now that it flipped, and now we see them with the mask off, with the role play finished. We only get a minute or two of it, and then it's over. So it feels very cheap. It feels like something that isn't very explored. And the fact that, for me, everything prior to it felt false because I was sniffing something was off. I felt like we needed to see the other side of that psychology, and we needed to explore where that came from, the dynamic other than that. And I guess it's quite limited, because if she is a call girl and he is her client, then in a way it kind of has to end there. But we never get to deal with the twist, if you want to call it that way, if you want to call it that, in the themes or in anything else that came before it, in my opinion. And I think that's the big problem of this movie. It just feels cheap. Whereas when we get swerves in all the other movies, it didn't feel cheap. It felt earned. It felt ingrained in the source material. It felt relevant to everything else. And I don't think there's enough there to go back, especially because I was on the hunt of something beforehand. I don't think there's anything prior that justifies that swerve. I don't know, or at least maybe there is, but it's not done well enough. Yeah, I feel like it's much lesser work. Still think he's a very worthwhile director, and I'm gonna let you do the work of Dirty Weekend. I'm not off the train, but this for me is a significant step down in every way. And I don't think he's formula, and there is a formula to this guy, I think by now I could safely say. Don't think the formula pulls it all together in this one. But I've absolutely thoroughly enjoyed the 3 movies prior that we talked about, so that's a very good ratio. And this is still a big swing, like you said, and big swings are always to be commended, and sometimes they just don't work.
Hey man, just taking a little afternoon stroll from the office, respond to your voice message. You focused mainly there on the ending, so I'll kind of pick up on that. I had no clue that what we were seeing was fake. I wonder, it sounds like your suspicion started right at the very beginning of the movie. So I guess you had that experience the whole way through. Obviously, that's a very, very different viewing experience than I had. The idea that you mentioned there of them being a married couple, that tracks, like that is a classic switcheroo that we've seen many times before. Yeah, I didn't have that at all. So I was taking it 100% as real, and it worked for me on that level a lot. I mean, the film obviously was a huge step down for you, but for me, other than the fact that the visuals are much weaker, I was having a grand old time with this movie. I will say, for me, it was a step down, but not a big step down. I think every film that we've seen from him is a step down in a way, but little steps down. I agree, Aaron Eckhart would have been great casting, I wonder if this character is influenced by Eckhart or originally written for Eckhart. What's the history there? Because The Shape of Things was the first film he did without Eckhart, and he'd done plays with Eckhart and stuff. So it was a bit of a sort of Scorsese-De Niro relationship for a while, and then at a certain point just ended. So I'm not sure what the backstory is there. You sort of mentioned on the subject of the twist that you felt it was consistent with the film. And more than beyond that, I think you kind of felt that it was consistent with LaBute's career. I kind of agree, I kind of disagree. I don't agree that Your Friends and Neighbors has that trope or has that repeated motif of actually everything you saw wasn't real, or like that. It's certainly something he's done 3 times in the 4 films that we've watched, but I don't think he's done it in Your Friends and Neighbors. Yes, it has an ending. The chick ends up with Jason Patrick, but I don't think that's sort of saying all of what this character was doing and saying up until this point was fake. Now, I also feel that this film doesn't follow that mechanic as closely as you're making out, and that's because You're in the Company of Men is about a liar, or it's about liars pulling the wool over an innocent person's mind just to get their kicks. That's what the film is about from the first scene, the opening scene in the movie. And then the twist is also about that, right? It's just that we learn that the thing that we've been seeing happening for the entire film, that we've known that the film is about, is being done to a different character that we didn't know it was being done to. The Shape of Things, the entire film, is about artificially molding and sculpting a woman artificially molding and sculpting her boyfriend into being something that he isn't, and the whole artifice of that. And at the end, we find out that she's doing that as an art project. But in both those cases, the twist is just the entire plot of the film is consistent with everything we've seen up until that point. It's just a slight slant on that, a new slant on that. Now, this twist just feels like it comes out of nowhere to me. And as you said, we're not given much time to digest it and try and understand and put it, sort of place it comfortably within the film, although you obviously had more time because you sort of saw it coming. But for me, I'm like, why, what does this have to do with the film? How does this help LaBute express what he's trying to express with the hour and a half of runtime that we've just watched? And there may well be an answer there, but it wasn't immediately forthcoming, and it's not something that I have in mind currently. I started wondering, is he Chris? Not literally, I don't mean his name is Chris, but is he imagining his father? Because we find out at the end, I believe, that he's a computer guy, whereas he always referred to Chris as the computer guy. And is he imagining if his father did this, or did his father have an affair with one of his lovers or something? There's something, perhaps something drawn from his life. We see him sort of frustrated and struggling to get what he wants. And is that then the end of the movie? We find out that he's like an incredibly controlling guy that's designed this really specific charade so that he can get what he wants. Like, it's difficult to know how it complements the film. But unlike in The Company of Men and The Shape of Things, it doesn't just seamlessly like stand in line with the entire overriding experience and narrative that we've been getting so far. So yes, he might be a Shyamalan in the sense that he likes twist endings, but the twist is very different. And going into this film, you know, we had seen the twist, I believe, in 2 out of the 3 movies. So, and we also missed other movies by him. So, if it is now to be taken that this is a given, that any future films that we watch by him will also have some like clever ending that reappropriates the rest of the film up to that point, then unfortunately that does put him in the Shyamalan camp of, you know, it's coming, so you're sort of trying to work it out beforehand, which has really hurt Shyamalan's career, I think. It's hurt the viewing experience of his movies. Anyway, as you said, I can fall on the grenade of the next one. I think this one was really good. Not, you know, it's not a timeless classic or anything. I think we are past that point in his career. But I like this kind of film, as I've said. I find the subject matter interesting. I find the actors and the dialogue interesting. I agree that it doesn't all work, that there isn't like total perfect chemistry between certainly Alasif, but even Tucci and the writing. And I think the writing isn't as strong as maybe it has been in some other bits of his career, but yeah, I'm still on board enough to go check out, I think it's Dirty Weekend or something is the next one. So if it's maybe if it's as good as Some Velvet Morning might rope you in. But yeah, anyway, I guess we've had a good little LaBute adventure anyway, even if this is where it ends for you.
No, I'm more or less agreeing with you in the context of Velvet Morning, whatever it's called. I feel like it doesn't jive at all with the film in general, and it fails at what it tries to do. I'm just saying it's consistent with what Neil LaBute tries to do in general in his work, in terms of something is revealed at the end, either through character or through twist, that recontextualizes some things that you see beforehand in a completely different way. It gives a completely different interpretation to the work. I feel like that's consistent in this movie. As far as the twist goes itself, I don't think the movie itself justifies the twist. And even though I was on the scent, as I said, even knowing that, it felt very much unexplored and very much thrown in there at the end anyway. Now, what I would have liked to have seen to this, which would have maybe added a layer or two, or at least allowed me to get into this and start questioning it. I would like to have seen a moment or two with Stanley Tucci's family, even if we didn't find out too much about it. Just see him interact on some level. It could just be a dinner where there's a few words here and there and a little bit of tension or a little bit of something that we can see applied to where he goes to later with this woman. That's what I think would have added to the movie. As it is, we get 120 minutes of one thing and then something else that doesn't really seem to expand on what we've seen prior to that in this movie, and I think that's why it ultimately fails. Yeah, I'll let you do the groundwork on the next one. I'm not off the train yet, but I am at the station debating whether I want to switch lines or not. Switch lines? Jesus Christ. Train analogies, man. But yeah, great mileage out of this guy anyway.
Your mailbox is full. Please delete new or stored messages which you no longer need so that new messages may be received.